When the milkshake doesn't bring the bag to the yard, what really happened when Khalees signed a dodgy deal with Pharrell.
Hello, and welcome to Whose Song Is It Anyway? Hosted by me, creative industries legal expert, Dr. HAYLEIGH BOSHER. I'll be your guide to the big legal questions shaping the music and creative industries right now. Think of this as your weekly dose of all things copyright, ownership, and intellectual property.
Let me tell you about sampling. So, here's a story. Beyoncé's last album, Renaissance, she has this track called Energy. In that track, she has taken a sample from a 2003 song called Milkshake that's performed by Khalees. You know, my milkshake brings all the boys to the yard. Everybody knows it. So, it's actually not a direct sample of the sound recording. You'll remember from episodes 1 and 2 when I kept banging on about those two different copyrights. You've got the musical copyright that's owned by the songwriters and or publishers. And then you've got the sound recording copyright, which is the physical recording of the track of the musical work that's owned by usually the producer, the record label, and you have rights as the performer. So what Beyoncé did when she took the sample of Milkshake is that she actually recreated it herself. She didn't use the sound recording. So what that means is the sample is not related to the sound recording right. It is only related to the musical copyright. This is sometimes referred to as interpolation. So when Khalees hears Beyoncé's new album, she is shocked to find that there's a sample of her song on there. And she's furious. She takes to social media to voice her concerns that no one asked her permission, she didn't get paid for the sample, and explicitly states that this was not a collab, it was theft. But what actually happened? The thing is, Beyoncé did actually get permission from the copyright holders. It just turned out that Khalees wasn't one of them, which is very surprising. In 2003, when Khalees co-wrote that song with Chad Hugo and Pharrell Williams, she was under the impression that the royalties and the ownership of the song was being split 3 ways. And she's actually said since then that she was only 19 at the time, and on reflection, she was blatantly lied to and tricked because she believes that she was told that everything was split 3 ways. But it turns out, shockingly, that actually she doesn't receive any royalties from the whole song album, her first 2 albums actually, that she made with Chad Hugo and Pharrell Williams. They are the owners of the copyright. So Beyoncé got her copyright license from the copyright holders, which in this case was Chad and Pharrell, not Khalees. Khalees is not actually even credited as a songwriter and doesn't own any of the publishing rights. So legally, technically speaking, what Beyoncé did was she cleared the rights. She didn't do anything illegal. However, Beyoncé still decided to remove the sample from the song after Khalees had voiced her concern, which is an interesting decision because legally she was fine to do what she did, and maybe she decided that she wanted to be supportive of Khalees. Maybe it was just really bad PR for her, but it just goes to show that clearing the license is not the only thing you need to think about if you are sampling. So what is sampling and where did it come from? Sampling wasn't actually always something that was paid for. It originates in hip-hop, 1965, South Bronx, New York, live hip-hop DJ sets where the DJ would mix together record breaks, cuts, and scratches. And at that time, there was this kind of moral, ethical code, as it were, that said you could sample, you can cut the record and use another person's music, but you were never just directly copying. You were transforming it, recontextualizing it, converting one aspect of culture to another, having a conversation. There was this kind of unwritten rule that it was about making something new, even if you took from a previous song or a previous piece of work. Hip-hop culture at that time had these kind of 4 principal elements: MCing, DJing, breakdancing, and graffiti, all of which have aspects of sampling, borrowing, and transforming other people's works in a creative way. So it's comes from this culture of conversation and evolution of creative expression, acknowledging and building on aspects of other people's creativity that you admire or even that you don't. And you sometimes it's like the opposite, right? But there was this real understanding of an ethical boundary around how and when is appropriate to sample. What's important to remember here is that sampling is much more than just extracting pieces of one song and putting it in the other. It's got this contextual, cultural background, where it comes from and how it's developed and evolved over time. When people first started sampling, it was like physical records on the decks. Now we have digital sampling, which is much easier. And we've seen in this evolution both of technology and culture, sampling spread out across all genres of music, as well as just hip hop and rap, the original kind of form. At the time when it was originally conceived and developed, it wasn't something that you paid for. Some of the early disputes we saw were Sugar Hill Gang's song Rapper's Delight, which sampled from Chic's track Good Times. Another one was Vanilla Ice, which settled with David Bowie when they took the bass line from Queen and Bowie's Under Pressure and used it in the song Ice Ice Baby. You probably recognize those two ones. Those early disputes were settled outside of court. Then gradually these arguments made their way into court. In the earlier days, the law was still kind of vague around this area. But around 2005, there was a case with NWA and their song 100 Miles and Runnin', which sampled a 2-second guitar chord from a track called Get Off Your Ass and Jam. And that was the first time that we'd seen like a substantial legal case with like a full judgment. It was an American case, and the judge basically said, at the end of the day, if you want to sample someone's work, get a license. So it's pretty clear from then on that if you want to license somebody else's work, from the copyright perspective, it's a copy. It's a copy of the sound recording and all the musical work, and therefore you need to get a license, you need to get permission. So if you're remembering from the last episode where we were talking about copyright infringement, it's the same test essentially. If you are taking a substantial part, and if you're sampling, you kind of are, because that's the whole point, is to take the recognizable part of the song, right? And put it into a new song, and maybe you shift it and change it and add your own personal stamp to it, but ultimately you're still using that sample, then it would fall potentially within the scope of infringement.
Just me interrupting myself to let you know that if you're looking for a guide to navigating the world of copyright in music and the creative industries, you can pick up the new edition of my book, Copyright in the Music Industry. In it, I share everything you need to know about copyright, intellectual property, and more on navigating the world of AI. And I go into much further detail about the topics I've spoken about today. It's straightforward, digestible, and most importantly, will empower you to make the right moves to protect your own work. I'll leave the link in the episode description for you to pick up your copy.
Can I sample that clip? And how much can I take before it becomes a sample? There's a common misconception that if you take a certain amount of notes or a certain amount of words, depending on whatever the copyright protected work is that you're doing, in fashion, I've heard it said, if you make 12 alterations to the skirt, then it's not copying. But the test is the same as the copyright infringement test that we talked about in the previous episode. If what you're taking is a substantial part of the original work, you're in the scope of infringement. It's not about how much you take, it's about the importance of the thing that you take. So it applies the same as the Ed Sheeran Sammy Switch case, where we talked about the parts that were similar were unoriginal parts that should be freely available for everyone to use, and therefore it wasn't infringement. So if you take a part of a song that's unoriginal as a sample and use that, then it shouldn't be a problem. But if you're taking the original parts, it doesn't matter if it's 2 seconds or the whole 3-minute song, that's irrelevant. The question is the importance of what you take, not how much you take. One thing to bear in mind is that we've talked a lot about the law of copyright and what it gives you, but there are also these limitations on copyright. So it's limited in time, doesn't last forever, although it does last a very long time. Copyright lasts around 70 years after the death of the creator, typically. Another way that it's limited is by these things called copyright exceptions. So a copyright exception is simply a circumstance where you don't need permission from the copyright holder to use their work. So in the UK, some examples would be for the purpose of education. So when I'm at work and I'm teaching students and I play some tracks, so play them some examples of tracks where there's been a copyright dispute, I'm allowed to do that within the walls of the educational institution without needing a license because I'm doing it for the purpose of teaching. We also have copyright exceptions for criticism and review. So if you want to review a movie and you want to show clips of that movie to explain the point that you're making, that's a copyright exception. Each of the copyright exceptions that we have under the UK law, there's like a list. It's called a closed list. So it's literally a list of the things that you can do. And each one has certain criteria. So if you want to benefit from a copyright exception, so you want to use a copyright protected work without permission, for example, to do a review, you must check what the little rules are for each of those things, because it's not a free-for-all. It's not like, oh, it's a copyright exception, I can just post the whole video and at the end be like, thumbs up, it was good, it was good. That's not going to fly. You need to check the requirements. Most of the ones under the UK law say that the use has to be fair and it genuinely has to be for the purpose that of the exception, and you only take as much as you need in order to fulfill that purpose. So those are like the general guidelines, but you really need to check them if you're going to try to utilize them. They're very helpful to be aware of in terms of when you're using other people's work and also when someone's using your work, whether it does fall within an exception or not. So as I mentioned, a sample could be like 2 seconds or 20 seconds or 2 hours. It's not about how long it is. And there's this really famous copyright case that's been going on for over 25 years. And they're arguing about a 2-second loop rhythm sequence. That's what it was about. So it's a German case and it started in 1999. And there's this 2-second sample from Kraft Werk's song used in a song called Nur Mir by Pelham and Haas. It years and years back and forth through the courts, and then it goes to the high court in Europe, trying to figure out like what the law says. And it goes on so long that the law actually changes during that time. It's crazy, right? So in the beginning, in 2020, the court said that the sample does not fall within the exception of quotation. In Europe, the court cases can go through the courts of that country. So this court case goes through the courts of Germany. And then the German judge, if they're like, oh, we're not really sure about how the European level law like applies in this situation, then they write a question to the Court of Justice of the European Union. So that's the European court, to be like, when you say this in the law, like when you say quotation is this, this, and this, does it apply here? Like how does that work? And then the CJEU were like, quotation doesn't count for sampling. That's not a thing. So it goes back to the German courts. This is how it works. And then during that time, because it took so long, there was a new law introduced in Germany for parody and pastiche. So they decided, okay, it might not be quotation, but what about if it's pastiche? And actually, the same thing happened. That goes through the German courts, goes back to the CJEU. And very recently, the CJEU said that pastiche is actually quite a broad term and pretty much means that you can evoke existing works as long as you are remaining different and that you engage with the original work as an artistic or creative dialogue, which I really like, because does that sound familiar to what we were talking about earlier about the hip hop conversation and the way that sampling was used with this kind of ethical understanding that you are engaging in the creative context and the cultural context of the creativity. So you're in conversation with, you're acknowledging, and you're improving, you're changing, you're introducing your own self and your creative expression within an existing work, or the other way around. So the CJU have said that you can use another work, so a copyright protected work, as a sample if it's different to the original and it engages directly with the original work as an artistic or creative dialogue. They've said that the term is broad and it can be critical or it can be satirical. It can even be a tribute. There are different ways that you can use the copyright exception for pastiche, provided that it is recognizable as such. So in this case, they specifically said that the sample that was used and modified was it changed genre from the first song to the second song, and therefore recognizably alluding to the original track. So we haven't had the final decision from, now it goes back to the German court and they'll have the final decision. This is very interesting because this is a completely different take on how we are considering when copyright applies to sampling or not. This is a German case and applies to the European Union and not the UK since we left the European Union. But our laws are very similar to theirs because our laws were based on the European laws when we were as part of Europe. So one to watch out for and see what the outcome is there. Another thing to note is that the courts have specifically said it's not a catch-all for creative use of protected material. So like any copyright exception, there are criteria, specific circumstances for specific purposes. So it doesn't necessarily mean that like all sampling will now be legal without a license, because that's not what they're saying. They're saying that if it's used for the purpose of parody or pastiche, that may fall within the copyright exception. In the UK, we also have a parody exception to copyright. It's been in the law since 2014. There's a few cases, but it's not firmly tested. In the same way that the German courts have said it's not a catch-all, it only applies in these specific circumstances when you are genuinely using it for the purpose of parody, it may apply. One to watch out for. Another really important distinction in copyright exceptions to remember is fair use is commonly misunderstood that it applies everywhere, and it doesn't. It only applies in certain countries. Like most US states have fair use under copyright. So the UK, I said, has a closed list of copyright exceptions. So literally a list of things that you can do, and each thing has special criteria that you have to follow if you want it. Fair use is considered broader and more flexible because there isn't a specific list. However, this is a bit of a misconception. There are criteria. You still have to be using the work within the scope of the rules around fair use. So, and that only applies in America, whereas the German law only applies in Germany and the UK law only applies in the UK for the purpose of considering whether what you're using is within a limitation or not. But that's really important to remember, especially if you're using a work from a rights holder that's based in another country. So let's say you are making a song and you do want to include a sample. How do we negotiate the sampling rate? There are so many factors to consider when you're negotiating a sample rate. So the sample rate will be influenced by things such as who you are, who the person is that you're sampling, who's the rights holder of the sample. Even though the copyright is about the importance of what you take and not the amount, when it comes to deciding how much you're going to pay for the sample, then it does become relevant. Because if you're using a 2-second sample, that's probably going to be cheaper than if you're taking the chorus of a really well-known song. So context of how much you're taking, the importance of what you're taking, and the context. So what are you using it for? Will it become in the new song a key element, or is it kind of hidden in the background a little bit, or disguised? Is it translating exactly, or are you making it your own? Do you need the sound recording right and the musical right, or just one of them? Just the musical right if you're going to re-record it yourself. There are so many factors. There's no set rate or fee. What I would say is that I've learned from artists that you get a better rate if you negotiate before you release the track. It is much harder to negotiate a rate afterwards because then, of course, you have the threat of a copyright infringement case. What you need to do is identify who the rights holders are, negotiate the terms of how much you're going to pay, whether it could be an upfront fee, it could be a split of your royalties for your PRS, for example. You agree the royalty split, you agree the rate, and then you acquire the license, ideally before you publish the song. There's a previous episode of the podcast where I talked to DJ SKT, and he tells a story about how he actually wasn't able to release a song because he wasn't able to clear the license, but the song was already made. He couldn't clear the license with the rights holders, couldn't make it happen. So sadly, that is a factor to take into consideration. If you release the song without getting the rights clearance, then you could end up, worst case scenario, being sued. And that might end up in an injunction or damages, loss of income from the song or the sound recording, not to mention the negative PR. So like in the case of Beyoncé, actually she had cleared the license, but other issues came to light around Khalees and how she wasn't properly credited for her song, and Beyoncé decided to remove the sample. So you need to consider more than just the song and the ownership. Actually, a context around it is sometimes really important. Often fees are higher post-release, and you don't have the same leverage for negotiation if the song is already out because there's the threat of an infringement claim. So remember, ask for permission, not forgiveness.
Okay, so that's it for today. Thanks for listening. Follow Whose Song Is It Anyway on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Amazon Music, or wherever you get your podcasts for more. And I'll keep on breaking it all down for you. In the meantime, you can grab a copy of my book, Copyright in the Music Industry, your go-to practical guide for navigating copyright and IP with clarity and confidence. I've linked to it in the show notes for you. See you in the next episode.